Hi there, let's talk about proteins. So we are on our third macromolecule. We finished carbohydrates, we talked about lipids, and now we are off to proteins. So if you're seeing how all of these are going, you're going to realize that all of these macromolecules are very important components of making our cells and ultimately the organism that we are. And so learning about every single macromolecule is super important. So learning about proteins is what's going on now. We're going to learn about nucleic acids, which is like your DNA, your RNA, the coding that makes everything inside you work the way it does. So we're going to learn all about that too. So that's our last macromolecule is nucleic acids. So let's focus on our proteins right now. And this is going to be Roman numeral 6, if I'm not mistaken. This is proteins. So proteins, you've heard about proteins. You eat proteins all the time. You might hear you need to eat more protein. Proteins are great. They're good to eat. They are the building blocks of a lot of things inside your cells. You are what you eat. So if you eat nothing but carbohydrates, you're going to have carbohydrates in your cells, but your cells also need protein to do their jobs because proteins have a huge function inside your cell. So let's talk about what proteins are, and eventually as we go on we're going to talk more and more about different functions of specific types of proteins within your cells. There's many, many proteins. Can't talk about them all. I wish we could, but we can't. But proteins, what these are macromolecules composed of amino acid monomers. So every macromolecule we've learned about has its own special type of monomer. If we go back to carbohydrates, the monomer that we love to use was glucose. If you go back to lipids, depending which lipid you're talking about, say for instance fats, the monomer was triglyceride. Now in this case, when we're talking about proteins, the monomer is called an amino acid. And you may have heard of amino acids. If you take protein powder or even some shampoos are fortified with amino acids because your hair is nothing but protein. You might have heard this language before. Let me show you what it looks like. So these are macromolecules, obviously. Made of amino acid monomers. And let's talk about amino acids, because we got to talk about the building block of proteins. So amino acids. These are special compounds, special molecules, and they're the monomer of proteins, obviously. And what happens when you link together many amino acids together, you start to create what's called a polypeptide. So the link between each amino acid is called a peptide. So for amino acids are joined together and to form a peptide bond. And many amino acids form a polypeptide. Amino acid structure is a little important as well because it uses functional groups that we learned about already. So for amino acid structure, here is what your typical amino acid looks like. So, your typical amino acid is going to have this functional group, if you remember what it is. There you go. That is amino acid. And if you're wondering what the R group, R is for, hang on one second, I will tell you. But I want you to focus on the functional groups really quickly. You have this NH2 here, that is your amine. And over here you have your C double bond OOH. That is your carboxylic acid. This is where we get the name amino acid from. Amino acid, amine acid. So you have your amino group and you have your acid group and you have your amino acid. This R group is something very special. They're variable groups. And the R groups are variable. And there's 20 different kinds of R groups out there in this world. In every species that we've studied, we all share the same amino acids. That's why if I go and eat any living organism, whether it's plant-based or animal-based, and I get the protein out of that living organism, I could use their amino acids to build protein in me. So you are what you eat. The only reason I'm able to rebuild protein in my body is because I eat protein. And so we're constantly recycling everything like that. So R groups are variable. There's 20 types of R groups. Therefore, there's 20 types of amino acids. Now these R groups can vary in how their properties are. They can be acidic, they can be basic, they can be polar or hydrophilic, they can be hydrophobic. There's many different things. It all depends on what the structure of that R group looks like. Let me give you an example of 2 different R groups, and you can see how vastly different they look. So I'm going to erase this really quickly. So one typical, I'll erase this on top too. One typical amino acid is called glycine. This is a very simple amino acid. You got your amino group, so every amino acid has this. Now, and for the R group, it's such a simple one, all it is a simple hydrogen. This amino acid is called glycine. Okay? Now, something a little bit different is another one called tryptophan. If you ever, this is related to feeling sleepy after you've had too much Thanksgiving dinner or you ate too much food, you're going into a tryptophan sleep. And it's not necessarily because of tryptophan isn't like it's not knocking you out or making you sleepy. You're just digesting so much your body just wants to sleep, which happens to me after Thanksgiving, and no, it's all good. So tryptophan has its own special R group, and it's a pretty complex one, so I'm going to check my notes so I don't accidentally steer you wrong. But it looks like this. And okay, you can see how complex this one is. That's tryptophan. Compare, and I'm making the rings a little bit shorter just to save for space, but glycine is just a simple little H for its R group. Tryptophan is this big ringed CH2 structure right there. It takes a lot more work to digest something like that than something as simple as that as well, too. So maybe that's why we get a little bit tired when we eat too much meat, because there's a lot of tryptophan in meat, and because it's protein based. So know that there are 20 different kinds of R groups. You do not need to know what those 20 different kinds of R groups are. If you ever take biochemistry in college, you will. You'll have to write them out probably. But for art class right now, please don't worry about it. What I do want you to know is this overall amino acid structure right here, where you have your amine group, your carboxylic acid group, your central carbon that's attached to the R group, which could be many, many different things, 20 different things to be exact, and that's how your amino acids work. Now let's put together a polypeptide so you can see how we start linking amino acids together. Because your proteins, a functional protein is made of one or more polypeptide chains put together. So let's construct a polypeptide. So this will be big B. Constructing a polypeptide. So let's put together 2 amino acids, and I'm just going to keep them basic by doing R. So we're going to add 1 amino acid to another. Okay. So we have amino acid 1 and amino acid 2. We want to bring these together, and these are both monomers. So whenever we link together 2 monomers, what reaction are we going to do? Dehydration reaction. You could basically see where we're going to literally squeeze some water out of this whole thing. This hydroxyl group, here's my functional group, you basically want to squish these together. This hydroxyl group is going to grab this hydrogen to make some water. So these guys are going to connect. And then what we're going to make is I have an amino acid here and I have an amino acid here. I'm going to create a dipeptide. So whenever you're talking about proteins and linking amino acids up, they become peptides. When they become functional, you have a protein. So let's put these 2 together. So we're going to squish these 2 amino acids together. So NH2, C, plus water. Okay. Now, what's important to notice here is amino acid 1, here is amino acid 2. Here would be amino acid 1, here is amino acid 2. That bond right in the middle between the 2 amino acids has a special name. Most of our linkages between monomers have special names, right? If we go back to carbohydrates, between 2 glucoses was a 1,4-glycosidic linkage. In the lipid world, in the saturated and unsaturated fats, we have ester linkages. Same thing here with the peptide world or the protein world. This bond right here is called a peptide bond. We've just essentially linked this carbon to this nitrogen and brought them together. This hydrogen flips down once that happens, because this double bond oxygen just takes up so much space it forces that hydrogen down. Okay? So you can imagine just constantly linking amino acids after amino acid after amino acid to each other. Once you get a long chain of amino acids, you have yourself a polypeptide. Okay? And constructing a polypeptide, this is how it's done. You got a dehydration reaction. So, dehydration reaction. And what you need to know is that a functional protein is made of 1 or more polypeptide chains. So imagine this chain just keep going on and on and on and on. That would become a polypeptide. It depends on the protein. Sometimes proteins just require 1 polypeptide chain to be functional. Once that polypeptide chain is made, it actually gets folded up and twisted into a certain shape. That shape is what gives it its function. I'm not going to go into the details on the folding and all that right now, but we could get to that later when we get to our molecular biology section later on. But what you need to know is that every polypeptide takes on a certain shape, and those shapes give it the function to make it a functional protein. Okay? And sometimes proteins require this polypeptide to take this shape, this polypeptide to take this shape, and then the 2 of them come together, and now you have a functional protein. Okay? Another thing you need to know is that in this example, I was just using R's to represent any amino acid. You may be asking yourself, how do you know which R group comes next in your chain? It's like you're making a necklace with 20 different colored beads, and you have to have those colors in a specific order. the way we know what order to put your amino acids, ultimately that information comes from your DNA. It's encoded inside your DNA. So I want you to know that, because we're going to talk about DNA next. And when we get to our molecular biology unit later down the road, you're going to see how your DNA codes for your protein. So functional protein is made of one or more polypeptide chains. The other thing I want you to know is that a polypeptide chain folds into a specific shape, and that gives it its specific function. So polypeptides fold into a specific shape which gives it its function. And lastly, the order of the R groups is ultimately determined by the DNA within your cell. So the order of R groups along a polypeptide chain is determined by the order of your DNA, or we'll just say your DNA, is determined by your DNA. And we're going to talk about this guy next. Okay? So proteins are a little bit shorter than the other macromolecules. Nucleic acids will be as well. So big takeaways for proteins: they're made of amino acid monomers. You put two amino acids together, in between them you have a peptide bond. Put many amino acids together, you have yourself a polypeptide. That polypeptide is going to fold and take a certain shape. Every protein has a different shape because every protein does a different function. So that's going to create a specific shape for that protein. And those R groups that are along the chain are going to determine how that shape works out. Then, to create a functional protein, it could either use one polypeptide chain, depending on the protein, or it may aggregate multiple polypeptide chains to create this ultimate larger structure to become the functional protein it needs to be. So that is proteins. Come back, we're going to talk about our last macromolecule, which is nucleic acids. And at the very end of all that, we're going to have a review and a summary table that we're going to put together that'll hopefully bring all of these macromolecules home for you. Thank you. I'll see you soon.